The cutlass came first, always the cutlass. Before the boarding hooks hit the rail, before the smoke cleared from the swivel guns, before the grenades came arcing over the side-trailing sparks, the cutlass was already in someone's hand. It was the weapon that defined an era, that carved its signature across 3 decades of Atlantic terror, that turned ordinary sailors into the most feared men on any ocean in the world. Short enough to swing in a cramped gun deck, heavy enough to split a man's skull through his hat, cheap enough that every pirate on every ship carried one, and brutal enough that its reputation preceded it by miles. But the cutlass was only the beginning, because what made the pirates of the Golden Age genuinely unstoppable wasn't one weapon. It was a system, a carefully assembled, ruthlessly practical arsenal built from stolen ships, captured armories, stripped naval vessels, and the accumulated knowledge of 30,000 men who had spent their lives learning exactly how violence worked at sea. They had served in the Royal Navy, where they learned to fight. They had served on privateers, where they learned to win. They had served on merchant vessels, where they learned what it felt like to have no power at all. And when they took those 3 educations and turned them toward their own purposes, they created something the Atlantic world had never seen before. This is the story of how they armed themselves, the tools they chose, the tactics they built around those tools, and why an era ended not because the weapons stopped working, but because the empires finally decided the cost of leaving those weapons in private hands was higher than they were willing to pay. To understand a pirate's weapons, you have to start with the world those weapons were designed for. Not the romanticized world of novels and paintings, but the actual physical environment of the early 18th century Atlantic. Because the ocean shaped everything. It determined which weapons were practical and which were useless. It determined the ranges at which fights happened. It determined whether a man lived or died based on decisions he made before the enemy was even visible on the horizon. The Atlantic of 1715 was a working ocean, a commercial artery that moved sugar and tobacco and silver and enslaved human beings between continents. And like all arteries, it attracted predators. The Spanish treasure fleets ran north through the Florida Straits, heavy with silver from the Potosi mines, predictable in their timing as the seasons themselves. English merchant vessels crossed from London and Bristol to the American colonies and back. Every route was documented, every route was watched. The pirates watched all of it. And the weapons they carried were chosen specifically for the work of turning that watching into money. Not for pitched naval battles between ships of the line, for something faster, closer, and more personal than any of that. For the 30 seconds of absolute chaos that determined whether you were going home rich or going home dead. The first thing to understand about pirate weapons is the distinction between ship weapons and personal weapons, because the 2 categories required completely different thinking. Ship weapons were about fear and paralysis. The goal of a pirate captain opening an engagement was never to destroy the target. Destroying the target destroyed the cargo, and the cargo was the entire point. What ship weapons were designed to do was convince the crew of the target vessel that resistance was irrational. If you could put enough iron into the air at the right angles, targeting the right parts of the ship, you could bring a merchant vessel to a halt without killing anyone and without sinking anything of value. Personal weapons were for the moments when the ideal outcome failed. When the target's captain decided to fight, when a boarding action turned into a brawl in the dark spaces between gun decks, when the spaces were too tight for a long weapon and too close for a firearm to reload, and you had approximately 2 seconds to make a decision with your body that your mind hadn't quite caught up with yet. The men who survived those moments were the men who understood in their muscles and their instincts exactly what each weapon in their arsenal was for and exactly when to use it. Start with the cannon, not because it was the most personal weapon in a pirate's arsenal, but because it was the one that made everything else possible. Without the ability to stop a ship, no boarding action ever happened. Without the boarding action, there was no prize. The guns that pirates carried differed significantly from what you'd find on a ship of the line. A first-rate Royal Navy warship might carry 100 guns on 3 gun decks, capable of firing a broadside that weighed over 1,000 pounds of iron. That kind of firepower was designed for one purpose: killing other ships of the line in fleet engagements. Those ships were slow, expensive, and drew too much water for the shallow approaches around most Caribbean islands. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. And they were fundamentally overkill for stopping a merchant vessel that mostly wanted to surrender anyway. Pirates worked with smaller, more flexible vessels. Sloops, brigantines. A typical pirate sloop of the 1710s might carry 8 to 14 guns, usually 4-pounders or 6-pounders, supplemented by swivel guns on the rail. A larger brigantine might run to 20 guns. Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge carried 40 guns when fully rigged. But the Queen Anne's Revenge was exceptional, a captured French slaver that Blackbeard converted into something closer to a genuine warship. What mattered wasn't the total weight of broadside. What mattered was the selection of ammunition. Round shot was the standard. A solid iron sphere bored to fit a specific gun. Round shot was what you used when you wanted to punch holes in a hull, bringing a vessel to a halt by forcing her to deal with incoming water. At close range, it was devastating to timber, splintering planking into a storm of wooden shards more lethal in some ways than the ball itself. A single round shot through a merchant vessel's hull, accompanied by the appropriate display of additional weapons in reserve, was often sufficient to convince a captain that surrender was the sensible course. But a round shot against rigging was wasteful. For killing rigging, for bringing down masts and yards and the web of rope that kept a ship sailing, pirates used chain shot and bar shot. Chain shot was 2 iron balls joined by a length of chain. When it left the cannon's mouth, the chain stretched out and the 2 balls spun in a horizontal plane, carving through rope and wood with a whirling path that was devastating to rigging. A single chain shot hit on a ship's mainmast, stays could bring the whole rig down in minutes. Bar shot worked on the same principle, 2 half balls joined by an iron bar. A pirate captain who wanted a specific ship to stop moving loaded chain, shot into his bow chasers, and aimed for the running rigging while still at long range. By the time the target realized they were under attack, their ability to sail away had already been degraded. Grape shot was the anti-personnel solution, a canvas bag containing a cluster of smaller iron balls, perhaps 20 or 30 of them. When the cannon fired, the bag disintegrated and the balls spread in a cone pattern, sweeping across an open deck like a horizontal hailstorm. At close range, grape shot was catastrophic to human beings standing in its path. A single charge across a merchant vessel's deck could kill or wound half a dozen men before the first boarding hook hit the rail. The combination of these ammunition types gave pirate gunners a flexibility that their reputation for crude violence doesn't capture. The opening long-range shots with chain shot to damage rigging. The mid-range broadside of round shot to demonstrate willingness to fight. The close-range grape shot sweep to clear the deck before boarding. This wasn't random violence. This was a tactical doctrine designed to achieve a specific outcome, a crippled ship, a demoralized crew, and a prize that remained intact enough to be profitable. Alongside the main guns, the swivel guns deserve particular attention because they were, in many ways, the most uniquely piratical weapons in the arsenal. A swivel gun was a small cannon mounted on a fork fitting on the ship's rail that allowed it to rotate horizontally through a wide arc. Operated by a single man. Could be aimed quickly and fired without the elaborate loading procedure a main cannon required. During a boarding action, swivel guns kept the enemy crew's heads down while your own men came over the rail. The man on the swivel gun wasn't aiming carefully. He was maintaining suppressive fire, putting enough iron in the air frequently enough that anyone standing upright on the enemy deck had a very strong incentive to be doing something else. The firearm most associated with pirates in the popular imagination is the Flintlock pistol, and for once the popular imagination is not entirely wrong. Flintlock pistols were carried in large numbers, often multiple pistols per man, for a specific reason that has nothing to do with style and everything to do with mechanics. A flintlock pistol fired once. Then it needed to be reloaded. Under good conditions with a practiced loader, this took approximately 30 seconds. In a boarding action in the dark between gun decks, with people actively trying to kill you and smoke so thick you couldn't see 3 feet in any direction, 30 seconds was an eternity you didn't have. The solution was to carry multiple pistols already loaded and primed, fire each one, and use the spent ones as clubs when you ran out. Samuel Bellamy's crew members gave depositions describing pirates carrying 3 or 4 pistols apiece, hung from ribbons around their necks or stuffed into a broad sash across the chest. Blackbeard is specifically described in contemporary accounts as carrying multiple pistols in exactly this configuration. The image became iconic, but it started as a practical solution to a practical problem. The musket was the longer-range firearm, and pirates used it in a tactically important way. On a naval warship, musketeers were posted in the fighting tops, the platforms built into the masts, and their job was to fire down onto the enemy deck during engagements, killing officers and gun crews at ranges of 50 to 100 yards. Pirates used top-mounted musketeers similarly. During the approach to a prize, before the range had closed to boarding distance, riflemen in the tops could engage the target vessel's helmsman and officers. Take down the man at the wheel, and the ship became much harder to maneuver away from you. Take down the officers, and the crew's ability to organize resistance collapsed faster. It was precisely targeted violence designed to produce a specific outcome: demoralization and surrender before the hard work of a boarding action became necessary. Now we come to the personal weapons, the things a pirate carried on his body rather than on his ship. And here the story becomes both more personal and more interesting. The cutlass was the defining weapon of the age. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Not because it was the most deadly weapon available, a properly aimed pistol shot at close range was more reliably lethal, but because it was the most versatile and the most consistently effective in the specific environment where pirates worked. A cutlass blade was typically between 24 and 32 inches long, single-edged for most of its length, with a curved section that swept to the tip. The curve was not decorative, it was functional. A curved blade drawn across a target did substantially more damage than a straight blade of the same length, because the cutting edge remained in contact for longer as the arm completed its swing. The hilt was typically a simple iron guard designed to protect the hand while allowing the quick grip adjustments close quarters fighting required. The weight was critical. A cutlass in fighting condition weighed approximately 2 to 3 pounds, heavy enough to carry real kinetic energy in a swinging cut, light enough to be swung repeatedly without fatigue, becoming decisive in a sustained engagement. The other characteristic that made the cutlass supreme was its durability. You could use it to pry open a hatch cover, to cut rope, to chop through lightweight timber, and it would still be sharp enough and strong enough to serve as a weapon when you needed it. Pirates didn't have access to regular maintenance. They needed weapons that survived without constant attention. The cutlass survived. Bartholomew Roberts' articles, the detailed code of conduct he wrote for his ships, contain provisions for the maintenance of personal weapons. Every man was responsible for keeping his personal arms clean and functional. A cutlass that rusted in its scabbard from Caribbean humidity, or a pistol lock so fouled with residue that the flint wouldn't spark, was a dead man's weapon. Roberts' articles made weapons maintenance a collective responsibility because he understood that a crew armed with malfunctioning weapons was a crew that lost boarding actions. The boarding axe was a companion weapon to the cutlass that served dual purposes so efficiently it became standard equipment on nearly every pirate vessel. As a weapon, a boarding axe was a short-hafted hatchet, heavy enough to break through a wooden door or a deck hatch, light enough to be used one-handed in a fight. But the boarding axe's primary function was as a tool. Getting from your ship to the target required traversing the gap between the vessels. The ability to cut a line, break a hatch, pry open a door, or drive a hook into timber was immediately valuable. The boarding axe did all of these things. It was held in the offhand, while the cutlass occupied the primary hand, serving as both tool and secondary weapon, depending on what the next 5 seconds required. The grenade is perhaps the most surprising weapon in the pirate arsenal. Surprising because it is rarely mentioned in popular accounts, and because its use required a level of tactical sophistication that the standard image of the pirate as a chaotic berserker completely fails to accommodate. Pirate grenades were ceramic or iron pots, typically about the size of a large orange, filled with black powder, sealed, and fitted with a short fuse. You lit the fuse, you threw the pot, and approximately 3 to 5 seconds later, the pot exploded and sent fragments in every direction. The tactical application during a boarding action was specific and effective. As your ship came alongside the target, before your men went over the rail, grenadiers threw grenades onto the enemy deck in the spaces where the largest concentrations of defending crew were visible. The explosion didn't need to kill anyone, though at close range it often did. It needed to break the enemy crew's concentration, scatter them from their defensive positions, create the 3 or 4 seconds of chaos during which your boarding party could get over the rail before the defense reformed. The psychological dimension of pirate weaponry was, in a very real sense, a weapon in itself. Fear, deployed correctly and in advance, could substitute for iron entirely. A merchant crew that was sufficiently afraid before the boarding began often didn't need to be boarded at all. They hove to, showed their colors, and waited for instructions. Blackbeard's burning beard fuses are the most famous example of this principle in action. Many pirate captains flew false flags during their approach to a prize, showing a friendly nation's colors until the range had closed too much for the target to run. The Jolly Roger, when it finally appeared over the approaching vessel, was raised at the moment when its psychological function was maximized. Close enough to be clearly visible, far enough away that the target still had a few minutes to contemplate the decision between resistance and surrender. The Jolly Roger itself has a history more complex than its iconic status suggests. The name almost certainly derives from the French Joli Rouge, meaning pretty red, which was the original flag flown by Caribbean buccaneers, a plain red flag that signaled no quarter given. The transition to black with a skull and crossbones happened gradually and was not standardized. Different captains flew different versions. Emmanuel Wynne flew a skull and crossbones with an hourglass. Bartholomew Roberts flew a design showing himself and death holding an hourglass together. Blackbeard flew a horned devil holding an hourglass and stabbing a heart. These were not random choices. They were considered statements, designed for maximum psychological impact on the people reading them from a distance. What they communicated was a specific, precise message that the approaching vessel was under the command of men who had opted entirely out of the civilization that governed the ocean around them, men who had no country, no employer, no legal obligation, and therefore no predictable behavior. You couldn't appeal to their king's diplomatic interests. You couldn't threaten them with courts. The question the Jolly Roger was asking from across 200 yards of dark water was very simple. Do you want to find out what our framework looks like up close? Most merchants decided they didn't. Bartholomew Roberts' weapon system was, by any measure, the most sophisticated personal armament carried by any pirate captain of the Golden Age. Roberts was observed by multiple surviving witnesses to carry, in combat, 4 pistols hung from a silk sash across his chest. A cutlass of unusual quality, reportedly taken from a Portuguese commander whose vessel he had captured in 1719. A short sword as a secondary blade weapon. And, according to accounts from crew members who testified at his trial, a blunderbuss loaded with multiple balls for the initial moments of a boarding action when he needed to clear space around himself quickly. This wasn't vanity loading. This was a considered selection of tools for each phase of a potential engagement. The pistols for the opening moments, the blunderbuss for close clearing work, the cutlass for sustained fighting, the short sword for when someone was inside his guard and he needed something shorter and faster. Roberts had thought about the geometry of violence and equipped himself accordingly. His articles specified minimum armament standards for every crew member. Every man was required to maintain his personal weapons in functional condition. Every man was assigned a battle station when an engagement was called. Roberts understood that organized violence outperformed disorganized violence in almost every conceivable situation. The irony is that Roberts's extraordinary organizational capability and his ship's lethality were what ultimately attracted the Royal Navy's focused attention. A pirate who captured 3 or 4 vessels a year was a nuisance. A pirate who had captured an estimated 400 vessels over 3 years and commanded a fleet that several colonial governors considered genuinely threatening was a different category of problem entirely. The Navy sent its best captain, Challenger Ogle, and its best available ship, the HMS Swallow, and hunted Roberts systematically until they found him. When they found him off Cape Lopez in February 1722, the decisive factor was not superior weapons. It was intelligence, deception, and the knowledge that Roberts's ships would be anchored with his crew in the degraded state that followed a night of celebration. Ogle approached under false colors. Roberts's crew failed to identify the threat correctly until Ogle was already engaging. Roberts himself was killed in the first moments of the broadside exchange, a grape shot round to the throat, and his crew, without their captain's direction, lost the engagement before it had properly begun. His crew threw his body overboard, as his standing instructions had required. The weapons he had so carefully selected and maintained went down with him or were taken by the Navy as evidence. His articles were read into the court record at Cape Coast Castle. His crew was tried. Most of them were hanged. The end of the golden age of piracy is, in one reading, a story about weapons becoming inadequate. But that reading misses the actual mechanism of the ending. The weapons didn't become inadequate. The same cutlass that had served a Nassau pirate in 1714 would have served equally well in 1730. The same flintlock pistol, the same cannon, the same tactics. The weapons weren't the variable that changed. What changed was the institutional context around those weapons. The Royal Navy reorganized. The Admiralty courts in the colonies gained authority to try pirates locally, without the expensive process of sending them to London. The pardons divided the pirate community, and former pirates hunting their former colleagues proved devastatingly effective because they knew everything: the routes, the hideouts, the informants, the habits. Benjamin Hornigold, the man who had built the Nassau Republic and mentored half the generation's most famous pirates, became one of the most effective pirate hunters in the Caribbean, specifically because he knew where to look. The weapons the pirates carried were answered by the same weapons, deployed by a different and more enduring institution. You can build a formidable arsenal. You can develop sophisticated tactics. You can become genuinely dangerous to the best-armed merchant vessels on any ocean. But if the institution arrayed against you can replace every man it loses, and you cannot, the arithmetic runs in only one direction, and all the cutlasses in Nassau's harbor cannot change it. By 1726, when William Fly was hanged in Boston and his body displayed in a cage above the harbor, the era was over in every practical sense. The men who had carried those weapons across 30 years of Atlantic history were dead, hanged, drowned, killed in action, or living quietly ashore under assumed names. The ocean they had temporarily made their own was back in the hands of the kings and companies it had always formally belonged to. What those weapons represented, beyond their functional purpose, was a specific and radical proposition about power. The men who carried them were making an argument with iron and gunpowder that they made no other way, that the ocean did not naturally belong to any king, that authority was not inherent in hierarchy, that a man who had spent his life at the bottom of every legitimate power structure could choose different terms and enforce those terms with sufficient violence to make them real for at least a while. The weapons made that argument possible. The blunderbuss and the cutlass and the chain shot and the boarding axe were the means by which men with no institutional backing confronted institutions with every advantage. And for 30 years, in the Caribbean and the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, those weapons were enough. Not forever, but long enough to matter. Long enough that the empires had to send their best ships and their most capable officers to end it. Because that is what it was. And the weapons that made it possible were never just weapons. They were the means of an argument. They were the tools of a world that existed, briefly and violently and with full knowledge of its own impermanence, on the far side of the line between law and the absence of it. The Cutlass came first, and the Cutlass lasted longest. And somewhere at the bottom of the Atlantic, in the wreck of every ship that ever flew the Jolly Roger, the Cutlass is still there, still in its scabbard, still sharp enough to cut through rope, still heavy enough to mean business, still waiting to make the same argument to anyone willing to listen. The ocean keeps its dead, and the dead keep their weapons.